So good afternoon and welcome to our webinar on safeguarding your food operations against Listeria in ready-to-eat foods. Our presenter today is Dr. Bob Strong. My name is Holly. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. Dr. Bob comes to us with quite an extensive experience in the area of food safety operations, lots of different standards and programs that he's managed and overseen. 47 years, and we probably need to update this Dr. Bob of experience, but worth mentioning that he is an avid trainer. He consults for us and does a number of different things and a thought leader in this space. So welcome, Dr. Bob, and thanks very much in advance. I'm going to kick the presentation over to you so that you can take control.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to show my screen. And I want to say welcome to everybody. And thanks for the fact that you have joined us again for one of our complimentary webinars, where the intention is to try to share our knowledge and experience with your knowledge and experience to make sure that you get the advantage of knowing what you know, what hopefully we can add to that. As Holly said, this whole thing is going to be recorded, so if you are unable to hear it right now and you're listening to it later, then that's why we're doing the recording. For those of you who want to get the recording and share it with some of your colleagues, you can do that as well. So what is our agenda today? We're talking about Listeria monocytogenes. We're talking about something that is a big concern to all of us as consumers, a big concern to all of us as manufacturers, and obviously a big regulatory concern. So we're going to talk about what is Listeria, why is it a concern, where would we find it, and how you would do something about it. So I will go through things like where would you look for it in your plants? How does it get into my plants? How do I keep it out of my packaging room, particularly when I'm packing a ready-to-eat product? How would I eliminate it if I found it? And how can I maximize my supplier relationships in them helping us avoid the Listeria, possibly even coming into our plants in the first place? We'll do question and answer, and as Holly said, you can type that into the chat room, and at the end, we will answer as many questions as we can. And if there are others that we do not answer, we will try to answer those in the form of email answers after the webinar. So what is Listeria monocytogenes? Well, it's a facultative pathogenic bacteria. So what does that mean? It's something that can grow in anaerobic, aerobic conditions, and it causes people to get sick. It can grow all the way down to 32 degrees. And at those temperatures, some of the other competitive bacteria won't grow, allowing Listeria to have an ability to grow without having to compete with other bacteria. It loves cooling water. So therefore, it likes plants that are wet. It likes cold plants, particularly as the other pathogenic bacteria like Salmonella will not grow in your coolers. It was identified initially as a human health concern in 1981, when in Canada, in Nova Scotia, they discovered that people were getting sick on coleslaw. And they found out that the coleslaw, the cabbage, had been exposed to sheep manure. And that was our first documented case of people getting sick on Listeria monocytogenes. We found out now it's also a threat to your pets. So therefore, there's a concern not only with human food, but also with pet food. We're going to have Holly ask you this first question so I can get a little feel for who's on the call today.
Sure. So I'm going to launch it here. We'll give you about a minute and I'll read through the responses. So how is your organization addressing the potential of Listeria arising? So perhaps it's that you feel confident in your food safety management system. It was designed to address all risks. You have an enclosed packaging area. Oops, sorry about that, a little typo there. You're doing environmental pathogen testing. So that should be the third bullet there. And perhaps you're not sure if you're protected. So you can select the response that's most appropriate for you. And we'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. What's been your experience, Dr. Bob? Where are folks mostly?
Well, I think some people, depending on the size of them, are a little bit more concerned that they may not be doing what they need to be doing. If they're a USDA plant, they've been doing it for a while, but FDA has only started to require it under the Food Safety Modernization Act. So I would think the concern's higher in an FDA plant than it is in a USDA plant.
Yeah, so just clarifying, folks, again, that third bullet point should say we are doing environmental pathogen testing. And we'll close this in a few seconds here. That's great. Okay, thanks, everyone. So, real even split between their food safety management system and how it's designed to address risk, and the fact that they're doing environmental pathogen testing already.
All right, well, that gives me a feel. So why is Listeria monocytogenes such a threat to the consumer? Well, if you get Listeria monocytogenes in your body and it then becomes listeriosis, there's a 20 to 30% chance you're going to die. That's not the rate with other pathogens. For instance, much more vulnerable, even though for the majority of this may not be that serious. But what else would it do for you if your company had a problem? It's going to give you irrevocable damage to your brand name. And we've had companies like the farmers who put out the cantaloupes a couple of years ago and killed 33 people that I'll come back to later, who actually went out of business because of this. We've had major suppliers who have made some ready-to-eat meats who survived, but it did cause them tremendous problems at the time. You don't always know you got a problem straight away because it took up to 70 days for some of those people who were at the cantaloupe to finish up dying. So it's not like you're going to know immediately you've got a problem. These are some of the major outbreaks which are just in basically the last 7 years. There's the cantaloupes, 2011, 146 people sick, 142 people went to hospital, 33 deaths from eating cantaloupe. I'm sure nobody would have thought that if you had cantaloupe, the chances were you were going to die. In 2015, we had the caramel apples that happened just around about Thanksgiving, and it resulted in 35 people sick, 34 people in hospital, and 7 deaths across 12 states. What's happening now in 2018, and it's something that started actually in January of 2017, so it's been going on for about 13 months. In South Africa, they've got a major Listeria outbreak. They haven't been able to source where it's happening. The number of people sick is now getting close to 1,000. The number of people who have died is getting close to 200. And in fact, it's just gone over 200. It's scary. So Listeria monocytogenes isn't just a North American problem. It's obviously a problem throughout the world. So you say, well, where does it come from? Raw milk, raw meat, raw poultry, raw seafood, soil, and you're bringing in vegetables with soil on them, birds, silage, which is the feed that you give to animals in the field, manure that may be being used on the fields, or it's actually getting on the fields because of wild animals running through the fields. So in other words, what we have to understand about Listeria monocytogenes, it is ubiquitous. That means it's everywhere. It means it's been everywhere for quite a long time. It's only since 1981 that we realized it's of human health concern. The FDA and the USDA has tried to give us some information, and obviously in other countries, your government should be giving you guidance on where Listeria is likely to be. Well, the FDA has listed it, and this is listed in the Preventive Controls for Human Food, HOPC training. They've indicated a really common source for it is raw milk, soft cheeses, particularly if they're made from raw milk, meat and poultry, vegetables, and unfortunately, we are finding it too often now in refrigerated, ready-to-eat foods. The USDA has listed it as one of the 7 most common pathogens associated with meat and poultry. When we look at all the recalls that we're having, and unfortunately we're still having a tremendous amount of recalls, as you all know, number 1 is allergens, which is almost 50% of the recalls. Salmonella tends to be in 20, 23, 24%. And Listeria is number 3. So it ranks up there as one of the leading causes of having class 1 recalls of products. And then FDA and the USDA have no tolerance for Listeria at any level in any product if it's ready to eat. So it's not like you can have a little in there and say, well, it's going to be safe. You can't have any in there. So you say, well, where's it coming into my plant? Because are you bringing it into your plant? In quite a few cases, the answer is yes, you're bringing it into your plant. So you can't say it's not there. You can't say I'm not bringing it in if you're bringing in raw milk, you're bringing in vegetables out of the field, you're bringing in potatoes out of the field, you're handling raw meat and poultry, you're definitely bringing it in. Now, on every one of those, every time, no, but there's a high probability. So when you look at your foreseeable hazards, it should be listed there. Your employees are bringing it on the shoes, depending on where they're coming from, particularly if you're in a rural area and they're bringing it in because they've been walking out in the fields and they've been walking out in the country roads or whatever. Dirty pallets, particularly if you're going to store those pallets outside your plants and they're going to get covered in dust and dirt and you bring them in the plants. How do you wash them? How do you blow off that dirt? In that dirt is a high potential of Listeria monocytogenes. Airborne dust. If you have a dusty environment outside your plants and your building is not tight and the wind blows the dust and it blows into your plants, this will be another source. Now I'm going to finish up giving you a whole lot of suggestions on what you can do to try to avoid it being in your packaging area later in this presentation. Because you say, where should I look for it? So where do I have to look for it? The FDA requires under FSMA that you look for it in your packaging area when you're producing a ready-to-eat food. So it's a law. You've got to look for it. You've got to be swabbing for it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. USDA requires you to do it. So now should I look for it anywhere else? That's up to you. The question is, if I find it in my plants, I need to get rid of it. Where do I definitely need to get rid of it? In my packaging area. Where do I have to, by law, look for it? In my packaging area. If I want to look for it in other areas of the plants, I have to understand that I may find it, and it may not be a big concern over there, particularly if I've got a heat step after where I find it. But when you're packing your ready-to-eat product off, there is no heat step coming later. So how would I find it? You have to establish an environmental monitoring program designed to find Listeria monocytogenes if it's present. Therefore, you have to have a program. This is something the regulator is going to look at. In the case of the USDA, they're already looking at it. You've already been doing it for a while. But in the case of the FDA, this is something that's only started to come about since the Food Safety Modernization went into effect. And for most of you, that was September of 2016 or September of 2017. Or if you're lucky, it's still September of 2018. But you're only months away from having to do it no matter what size your plant is. So now you have to decide, where am I going to swab? Am I going to swab food contact surfaces? I'll come back to that in a minute. How frequently am I going to swab? What am I going to look for? Am I going to look for Listeria monocytogenes, or am I going to look for Listeria species? Am I going to look for other pathogens? I'll talk about that in a minute. And the big question is, what do I do if I find it? And we'll talk about that. So in order to set up an environmental monitoring program, at each individual plant, you need to decide how I'm going to break it into zones. And the FDA gives you guidance on that. And so therefore there are publications out there by the FDA. It is part of the preventive controls for human foods, which we teach. So if you haven't been to that class, I would recommend you go to it. And you start off, obviously, identifying your highest risk areas. And those are the packaging area where you're packing off a ready-to-eat product that's exposed to the environment, and there is no heat step coming after this for you, and there's certainly no heat step coming after this on a ready-to-eat product for your consumer. They're going to open up your product and they're going to eat it. So the zone 1, your most critical zone, is going to be your packaging area. We're talking about in a minute whether that's an area or a room. Your processing areas, which are close by, would be your second highest vulnerability. And how are they segregated from that packaging area? Because if they're segregated, they're less of a threat to what's going on in the packaging area than if they're not segregated. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Your zone 3 could be your GMP areas. So where are you storing stuff? Where do you receive stuff? Where do you store it? And this would be coolers, and this would be dry storage areas. And then the last area will be those transition areas, your lockers, your halls, your break rooms. You may want to add your restrooms, your maintenance area, etc. And you have to determine how often am I going to swab in these areas. Well, obviously, you're going to swab more frequently in the zone 1, the packaging area, and less frequently when you get down to the transition areas. And you have to determine that based on risk to your finished product. And a risk to your finished product is going to be higher if you're making a ready-to-eat product. Now, what should I be swabbing for? Well, the FDA has indicated you should be swabbing for, and they require you to be swabbing for, Listeria monocytogenes or Listeria species if you're making a ready-to-eat product. Now, should I swab for other pathogens? Well, if one of your foreseeable hazards you've identified in your hazard analysis for your food safety plan is Salmonella, then clearly that would be another pathogen you would be swabbing for, or an indicator organism. E. coli would depend on whether you believe you're bringing E. coli in, which, if you remember, only comes from fecal material. So if you're bringing in raw animal products, there's a high probability of bringing in E. coli. After that, you have to determine whether E. coli is a foreseeable hazard for you. So when we go back to what you have to swab for, Listeria or Listeria species. You may be swabbing also for Salmonella, particularly if it's a foreseeable hazard. A lot of you will not be swabbing for E. coli unless you really believe it's a foreseeable hazard. So where should I look for it? Because I got to try to find it. I've got to make sure that if I find it, I get rid of it. I can't be swabbing not to find it. So I think the first thing you have to understand is you're trying to find it. There's not a problem in trying to find it. Your problem is if it's there and you don't find it because you really didn't try to find it, then that's your biggest problem. Because it's going to jump in your product, give you a problem, and it's going to cause you to get sued or have regulatory action. So where am I going to look for it? Well, one of the common places is a drain. But don't assume because you find it in the drain that that's what it's living. That's what it's finishing up. So yes, clean the drain, get rid of the Listeria in the drain, but then let's try and find out how it's getting in the drain. The condensate collection pans, how many of you are swabbing in there? There was one company a few years ago who took out all their cooling units in their packing room over a weekend in order to install new refrigeration cooling units. And apparently didn't realize that in those condensate collection pans that they had just dismantled and taken out, there was residual Listeria monocytogenes in there, which then got spread in the plants, got in their product, and caused 23 deaths. My job is not to tell you who that company is. If you want to Google, you can most certainly find it. So don't ignore those condensate collection pans as being a potential reservoir for Listeria monocytogenes. It's going to live in cracks and crevices, those little small cracks and crevices that you have to get down on your hands and feet. You have to get down on your belly. You have to crawl under stuff to find it. And that's where the Listeria is going to be living. and all you're doing is cleaning the drains. When it finishes up, you're not getting rid of what it is, so it just comes out again later in the day. You've got to get in those hard-to-reach areas, which are hard to reach for cleaning, because that's where it's going to live, because it's hard for you to get in there and get it out of there, but you've got to get it out of there. How about your employees' shoes and boots? If you're allowing them to come from home and they walk all around the plant and they walk into your packaging room, is that how it's getting in there? How about the ductwork that brings the air into that packaging room? Where's it bringing the air from? From the other part of the plant where the Listeria is coming in on the soil, on the vegetables, on the raw milk? Is it coming into the air that's coming from outside that you're sucking in as makeup air? We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You have any windows in the packaging room? And even though the windows are tight and it can't be opened, there's going to be a possibility of little leaks around those windows where Listeria can blow in from outside. Now, should I be looking for it on food contact surfaces? You got to make a decision, yes or no. If you're a USDA plant, the government made that decision for you, and the answer is yes. You have to swab food contact surfaces in a USDA plant. If you're an FDA plant, you currently do not have to swab food contact surfaces. Now you say, well, what if I want to? There's nothing that says you can't. The problem is you have to remember if you get a positive from swabbing a food contact surface, you have to immediately go to the product that was last on that surface and test the product. So that means that product can't go out the door until you get that result. So if it's taking you days to get the results, then you've got a problem holding that product if it's short shelf life. Now, there are companies, there's one company who's already introduced the ability for you to get these results in minutes, and there's another one being introduced next week at the GFSI conference in Tokyo. So you can buy equipment that will get you those answers straight away. But why swab a food contact surface if you don't have to? So when does the FDA recommend that you should swab? They say you should swab after cleaning, but before you sanitize. You're trying to find it. Don't wait till after you sanitize and that's the only time you swab. It may have been there and you killed it with the sanitizer, and now you're saying, I don't have it. Well, of course you don't have it anymore. You just killed it. If it doesn't mean it wasn't in your room, it doesn't mean it couldn't have possibly got in the air, and it doesn't mean it couldn't have gotten your product. It just means I can't find it now because I sanitized it. Therefore, they're recommending you do it prior to startup. Do it after sanitizing as well. So if you get a positive before you sanitize and you get one, you don't get one after you sanitize, then at least you know that sanitizing has an impact on it if I can get to the reservoir where it is. Well, we're finding out from companies who are willing to share some information that they're finding that the area is clean of Listeria after cleaning. They're finding it's clean when they start up, but they're finding after about 3 hours of running, all of a sudden it's in the room. Well, that suggests it's coming out of the bearings on a drive motor on a belt, and therefore that's where your reservoir is, but you wouldn't know that if you weren't going out and doing a swabbing 3 hours after you're running while the room is a little messy, it's got some product laying around, etc. So I would suggest you try all of the worst conditions to do the swabbing, not all the best conditions, because you're trying to find it. So incentivize your people to try to find it. There is no punitive action coming from a regulator if you find it and get rid of it. Where you're going to have punitive action is when you find it and you don't get rid of it, or you don't find it and they find it, or worse still, they find it in your finished product after it went out the door. The other time they're talking about is obviously do it at the end of the shift, before you clean, before you do anything, while the product's all on the floor, while the place is in its worst mess. If you're finding Listeria monocytogenes in your packing room at that stage, then you've got some issues that could result, I didn't say do, result in you having contaminated product. You say, well, when should I get to do more frequent swabbing? You're doing some construction. You're breaking walls. You're disturbing the environment in your plant. You're possibly creating dust. You're possibly releasing the pathogen, Listeria, or maybe Salmonella, out of areas that were in that wall that you've just started to break out. You're bringing in new equipment. Be a good time to make sure that, one, you can clean it. Two, it doesn't become a reservoir for Listeria. Three, it isn't bringing Listeria, Salmonella in on that equipment. You change your process. You change your raw material supplier. You are bringing in Listeria that wasn't coming in before on your previous raw material or your previous supplier. And we'll come back later to what you want your suppliers to do to help you in this endeavor. If you do any major maintenance, it's not construction, it's not new equipment, but it's major maintenance, this would be a good time, again, to be swabbing for the presence of Listeria species. So how can I sample? You can use swabs, sponges, gauze, contact plates, air samplers. You can work with the supplier of these to get recommendations from them. It doesn't matter how you do it, as long as the way you do it's effective in finding it. You're not going to get negatives when it's positive, because that's going to be misleading for you. Hopefully you don't get false positives when it's not there, but those are a little less dangerous than failing to find it when it is there because you got a false negative, meaning it should have been a positive. So how can I eliminate Listeria on these raw materials and in my finished products if you say I'm bringing Listeria monocytogenes into my plants? Well, for those of you who have a heat process, that's obviously one of the best ways to get rid of Listeria on your raw materials. But that only works if you've got a heat process. And a lot of you may be doing ready-to-eat foods made out of ready-to-eat ingredients, like you're in the deli industry, you're in the salad industry, you're making stuff out of stuff that you could have eaten the raw material itself, because at that stage it was ready to eat, maybe needed washing. So you're not going to have a heat step. And remember, the ready-to-eat product, the definition is the consumer's not going to apply heat to the product. So therefore, if you send it out with Listeria in it, the consumer's not going to heat it. You can add some acidification and drop the pH below 4.4 using things like sorbic and benzoic acids. You can use some listericidal things if they're legal in your product. And then after you pack your product off, if it had Listeria in it, over a period of time between you making it and it getting to the consumer, that listericidal chemical would kill off the Listeria. So can you send out a ready-to-eat product with Listeria in it and still be legal? Yes, if you have something in there that will kill the Listeria prior to the consumer eating the product. But a lot of you won't want to add those chemicals. The consumer won't want you to add those chemicals. So that may not be a choice you have. So therefore you're back to keeping the Listeria out of the product versus trying to do something about it after it got in the product. In your plant, you could use antimicrobial agents, peroxyacetic acid washes, provided that they do the job, that you maintain the concentrations, that you and the chemical company can prove they're effective, and they remove the Listeria. Now, does that mean you didn't bring the Listeria in? No. So therefore, at the dirty end of your plant, the Listeria is there, you washed it away, and now you got to make sure it doesn't get to the other end of your plant and get on the ready-to-eat product, having spent all this money to get rid of it. You can take your finished product and you can send it off to high-pressure pasteurization. And there are certain deli meat suppliers who are doing that now. It's costly, it's slow, but if you're worried that you possibly could have Listeria in your deli meats, you may be willing to spend that money to have somebody do high pressure pasteurization. Another industry that's doing that is coconut water that's coming out of the foreign countries like the Philippines coming into America. It's a raw product. They want to keep it raw. They want to keep all the health benefits of it. So they're bringing it in and subjecting it to high pressure pasteurization. And then they're putting out basically a sterile coconut water. You can do irradiation. But again, you can only do that if one, your product clearly can be irradiated, and two, you indicate on the package that you irradiated. And if that's a negative to your consumers, I'm not sure you're going to take that option. So what do I mean by other choices? If you can get your suppliers to control the potential for Listeria on anything you're buying from them, raw materials, ingredients, then push the hazard to them, but then make sure they're doing it. But I don't think you're going to be able to push the hazard to the farmer and say to the farmer, I don't want you sending in any vegetables with soil on it that could have Listeria monocytogenes in it, because the farmer can't do anything about it. So you're limited to who can do something about it if you're going to push it back to your supplier. But then you want to make sure you get that in writing. You want to make sure that they have good programs. You want to make sure they're not sending Listeria to you, so that you don't bring it in on the dirty end. And I use that in italics, dirty end, so it doesn't get to the clean end. You can push it down to your customer, but not to the consumer. So if you say, I think I'm going to possibly have Listeria in my ingredients, I'm going to push it down to my customer who's a further processor, and they're going to take care of it. And again, make sure you tell them that you're not taking care of this hazard or any other hazard in writing, and make sure you get from them that they're going to control it. But I wouldn't want to do that with a ready-to-eat product, because by definition, you sending it to somebody, whether it's a consumer or another customer, and saying it's ready to eat. If it's ready to eat, it can't have Listeria in it. So how am I going to prevent Listeria monocytogenes getting into my packaging area? See, and that's the sensitive area. That's the area where the FDA says I've got to be doing swabbing. That's the area where my product's exposed. So if everything goes wrong now, there is no step after this. How many of you have got a packaging area versus a packaging room? Now, when we talk about a room, we talk about something that has walls around it, something that isolates that area from the rest of the plant. You say, well, that's not what I got, Bob. I've got one big room, and we start processing the product at one end. In the middle is the in process, and then at the far end is where we pack it off. Well, you've got a much bigger challenge than the person who has a segregated packaging area. Therefore, they got a packaging room. Because if you can isolate that packaging machine to a room where you can control the environment better, you've got a much better chance of keeping Listeria out of that room. Now, it doesn't have to be solid walls. There are those curtains that you can put on hooks attached to the ceiling, and you can pull those curtains around that area, and you can limit air movement into that area. And we're going to talk about other things being limited going into that area. That's up to you. Your management has to make big decisions now about how am I going to keep Listeria out of an area when it's part of a bigger area, when I'm going to have trouble keeping it out of the bigger area because the packaging is part of that. Now, if you've got a small area, meaning a room, you can put a positive air pressure in there. And now you're going to be blowing stuff out of that room, not in. So if Listeria is floating around in the rest of your plant, it's not going to go in that room because the positive air pressure is blowing out of the room. You have to determine, can I do that? It's going to be very difficult to do that if your packaging area is part of a bigger area. Then you're going to have to make your whole processing area under positive pressure. And I've been to plants that do that. But that's not without a whole lot of engineering, not without a whole lot of costs. The FDA recommends that you don't have any trench drains in that actual packaging area because they are being shown to be really good reservoirs for Listeria. They're difficult to clean. they tend to start getting nicks and cracks in them. They start to have the concrete start to break up. They start to have the tiling at the edge of them start to chip. You start to get a whole lot of areas around that trench drain that are going to be a real problem for your sanitation people to clean. And you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. So don't put a trench drain in there. And if you've got one, I would recommend you fill it in. You fill it in with concrete and you make sure it's a smooth, cleanable surface. If you've got outside windows here, you may want to consider taking those windows, taking them out, and bricking up the whole window area. Because again, no matter how tight that window is, it's another possible source of Listeria blowing in from the outside. What else would I recommend? Now, again, a whole laundry list of things now. So again, you're going to get a copy of these slides. But again, sewer lines flowing away from this area. You shouldn't have sewer lines flowing into this area under the floor. Everything should be flowing away from this packaging area. You certainly don't want to look up and see sewer lines up there because you got a mezzanine above there or you got offices above there, and worse, you got restrooms up there. You're talking about a disaster waiting to happen. So you want sewer lines not flowing to this area, but away from this area, and you don't want any overhead sewer lines anywhere near this area. Go outside and see where you're bringing in the air that's the makeup air into this area. Is it coming from an inlet that's very close to your outside garbage? Then you're going to be sucking in stuff from the air that's right around your garbage that may very well be a breeding ground for Listeria monocytogenes, Salmonella, or anything else. In this area where you've got all these fillers, you obviously may have catwalks and stairs and things that allow you to get up so you can be looking at the filler, you can be controlling the filler, etc. And that's fine. The point is, are these areas that when you wash down and you clean, they don't pool water. They don't hold water in certain areas. It's difficult for you to get the water out of there. And now they become an area where the Listeria could be harbored. How about your conveyors? How about anything that moves in there? Are the bearings totally enclosed? If not, what you're going to have is another potential reservoir for Listeria. I keep saying Listeria because that's what we want to concentrate on, but don't forget that could be Salmonella or other harmful bacteria that you're going to have a hard time getting out of those bearings. On all your totes and garbage cans that you use in this room, do they all have cleanable wheels so that you can get down and clean them? Whether the sanitation group has to use little brushes or stuff, are they cleanable? They're not cleanable, get them out of there. Get them at the dirty end, where it doesn't really matter. But have your highest quality totes and garbage cans up in this room. Are you using sanitizer door sprays? So when you wheel anything into this room, whether it's a pallet jack, whether it's a garbage can, it comes through this spray on the floor and is sanitizing the wheels as it moves in case you're bringing something in on those wheels. Do you limit the use of filtered compressed air in this room? So you only use it if you really need it, and it is filtered, and it is filtered with filters that are small enough to be able to take out most harmful bacteria, so that you're not blowing the bacteria into or onto your equipment from these compressed air lines. You don't want wooden pallets in this area. Now, having wooden pallets at the dirty end, having wooden pallets in your packaging pack off, which is out in the warehouse, is fine. So the ideal thing in this room, obviously, is the product should be coming possibly through a little hole in the wall from your in-process line. It's still not covered. It comes in this room, it gets covered, and then it gets packed off and gets covered. And then it goes out of this room and gets cased off in the warehouse. Now, there's wooden pallets out there, no big concern. Now, if you need pallets in this room, how about plastic pallets? How about pallets that can be washed? Do you have a pallet washer? That would be even better, where you can take these plastic pallets and wash them on a fairly frequent basis. Have a dedicated 3-compartment sink, dedicated only to things that are in your packaging room, parts of the equipment that you take apart, anything in there that you use in that room, that you can take over to a 3-compartment sink that's only used for the packaging area. Dedicate the garbage cans and totes so they're clearly identified as belonging in the packaging room. So now you may want to get into colors. So you may want to get into a white color for the packaging area, and maybe it's gray in other areas. Something that differentiates it so you don't finish up with one of these dedicated garbage cans getting into an area where it's not supposed to be and then somehow migrating back into that packaging area again. Have dedicated cleaning equipment, whether it's a mop, a brush, a dustpan, whatever it is, dedicated to only being used in the packaging area. Now, remember, we're talking about being this strict when you're making a ready-to-eat product. You say, well, I'm not going to do this. We don't make a ready-to-eat product. Well, you're taking less risk. But when you've got a ready-to-eat product, you have to go to some of these steps. Now, whether you want to go all of these, and I got some more in a minute, that's up to you. That's a management decision based on risk. The downside is if you get Listeria monocytogenes in that room, it gets in your product, you're going to have a class 1 recall, you're going to possibly get sued by lawyers if you get people sick, and certainly if you kill them. And you've got the FDA coming in to look at you because you've had a recall of Listeria in your product, and they're going to come in and they're going to start blitzing your area doing swabs to find what you failed to find. So what else would tell me that I could have Listeria monocytogenes in this room and be giving it an environment in which it can live? Standing water. There's no way you want standing water in this area. So if you have a problem with water in this area, you've either got to squeegee it to a drain, but we don't want those trench drains, or you're going to have to vacuum it up. But what you want to try and do is avoid having any water in this room at all except during sanitation, and then make sure when sanitation's over, you get rid of all cooling water. If you're forming condensate in there when you're cleaning, make sure you're wiping down all the condensate on those overhead pipes, the overhead area where you climb over your equipment on those mezzanines. Now, if you're a USDA plant, you've already gone through all this. The USDA's got those plants where they need to be. The problem with FDA plants, you haven't had this guidance. You haven't had this regulatory oversight. Make sure the condensate in those cooling units allows the water to flow away and not sit in there stagnant. So take a look at those pans and make sure they do slope to one end, to a drain, to a pipe that preferably goes out of the room into a drain outside the room, or goes outside the plant, but doesn't pool outside the plant, because then you get into other issues. Don't use a water hose in here while you're packing any product off, because now you're introducing water, you're introducing the potential for cooling water while you've still got your product exposed in that room. Regularly sanitize all those condensate pans. So not only have them drain, but also have them on a regular sanitation program that somebody gets up and either sanitizes them on a regular basis, or even puts some little sanitizer blocks that some of the major chemical companies have that you can put in those pans, which slowly dissolve over a period of time, and constantly are putting sanitizer into that cooling water, stopping them being a reservoir for Listeria. So talk to your chemical company. I'm sure most of them will have something for you that you can put in those condensate pans, and we know that is a good reservoir for Listeria monocytogenes. So how else can I stop it getting in that room? Go to employee captured boots, clothes, and shoes and clothing. So in other words, as this is a highly sensitive area with a ready-to-eat product, so therefore it's a high-risk area, you need to be buying boots and shoes for the employees that they never take home. And when they come to work, they change out of their street clothes, which may be carrying Listeria on them. They change out of their boots and shoes, and they keep them in the locker room, and they don't go anywhere near the packaging room until they've got on this clothing that you're having laundered, these boots and shoes that never go outside the plants. And I got to be careful they don't go out on break in them. They don't go to the restroom in them. They basically understand these are boots that you use in this area, and when you leave this area, you take them off, and then you put on your regular shoes if you're going on break or you're going out to smoke, because otherwise you just destroyed your whole captured boot program. It's up to you whether you get boot washers. I've gone into a lot of plants that have boot washers, and they find they're pretty effective. It's up to you. If you feel that I don't need to go there because I've been swabbing the boots and I haven't been finding any Listeria on them, and so we think that our captured boot program's working real well without the expense of boot washers, then there's nothing that says you have to put boot washers in. You say, well, I want to control it with sanitizer mats. Well, make sure the employees don't jump over the mats. Make sure they walk through them. Make sure there's enough sanitizer in there to at least cover the base of the boots or the shoes. Make sure that somebody's changing the sanitizer on a regular basis, because if not, it's not going to be effective. Restrict who goes in this room. The only employees who should be in this room are the employees who need to be in this room. You may want to therefore decide that employees working in this sensitive room wear a different colored uniform to other employees in the plant. So immediately you can spot somebody who's in the room who shouldn't be there. Now that's up to you. There's nothing that says you have to do that. You could say, well, what if I go with a colored hairnet? You could do that. But something that would allow you to see that somebody's wandered into this room who could be a threat to bring in Listeria into that room. The FDA also suggests that you consider separate changing rooms and lunch rooms for these employees. Now, again, if you go to a USDA plant that's got raw meat on one end and it's got ready-to-eat meat on the other end, they've been doing that for years. Those employees have separate changing rooms. They have separate lunch rooms. And even when it comes to going in the restroom, they have separate hooks outside the restroom where they hang their uniforms so they don't hang somebody's uniform, the dirty end, where all the blood and everything is, right next to somebody who's working with the ready-to-eat meat. You also have flow in those plants that everybody walks from the clean end, the ready-to-eat end, to the raw end. That hasn't been the world of FDA plants, but now it has to be. If you're making a ready-to-eat a product, and therefore you have a potential to have Listeria monocytogenes in that packaging area, you better be controlling your people flow in all aspects. You need to clean and sanitize all the wheels daily on all movable equipment. You have to limit construction to non-operating days. You have to limit all your maintenance to non-operating days. I would suggest you have dedicated maintenance tools. And if you haven't examined your maintenance department's tools for how clean they are, you may be rather amazed how dirty they are, and yet they're taking them into your sensitive areas. Swab some of them and find out what's on them. I think you're going to find out that sometimes they're pretty gross, what you're going to find on them, and yet you're allowing maintenance people in your plants or contractors to bring these dirty toolboxes, these dirty tools into this highly sensitive area called a packaging area for ready-to-eat foods. So how am I going to get rid of it? Thorough cleaning of the site where it's found. Thorough sanitizing this area. A root cause analysis to find the source. If all you do is clean where you find it, sanitize where you find it, and keep on moving, you're not going to get rid of it. You've got to find where it is. Now, if you do the cleaning of where you find it, and you do the sanitizing, and it never, ever comes back, then maybe you did find the reservoir. But I'm going to tell you the chances are where you find it initially is not where it's living. So you got to get down on your hands and feet. So you say, well, what can I do to wrap up so we can do some questions and answers? Well, if you're going to handle these more risky raw materials, then obviously you're going to be bringing Listeria in your plant. So if you want to avoid it, don't bring them in. So instead of bringing in raw milk, bring in pasteurized milk. Instead of bringing in vegetables that got soil on them, have somebody else prepare them. And then you bring them in already washed and diced and sliced and all that. That may be impractical for your business. It may be the difference between you making a profit and not making a profit. I'm not saying that you have to do that. What I'm saying is that you have to make sure that you understand your potential as you are bringing Listeria in. You can restrict your people. So one of the important things when making ready-to-eat products is not only the flow of the product, but the flow of the people. And the people should be flowing the opposite way to your product flow. So you should be having people moving from the packaging area to the other areas and not having anybody moving from the other areas into this packaging area. That's why it becomes important that this area is a room versus an area. Dedicate your pallet jacks, your forklifts to this area only. Yeah, that's expensive. Now maybe you have to have a pallet jack that just does this area, and therefore that one's tied up there. But don't move it to the other areas. Don't have a problem where a pallet jack in another area goes down, so somebody comes and borrows your packaging area pallet jack because they need it somewhere else. Unless you want to bring it back and almost dismantle it and clean it, having got it to a point where it has not been exposed to the Listeria, but now you let it go down the dirty end. Have a positive air pressure in this area. Do you have to do that? No. Is it possible for you to do that? Maybe not. But if you can do that, it's certainly a good suggestion. A positive air pressure in the packaging area. Avoid pooling of water in your plant altogether, but certainly avoid pooling water in this area. I'm going to turn it back over to Holly and try to cover a lot there for you because it is a very intense type of area. It's an area that people need a lot of help on. So Holly, what type of questions did we get?
Lots, Dr. Bob. So let me start. Okay, let me start with this one here. So I've read the most common places to find LM is equipment, freezers, floors and drains, and ventilation systems, all of which you touched on. But can I completely eradicate LM from my plant?
Well, the question is, hopefully you can. If you can't, and you can make a ready-to-eat product, and if it finishes up in your product and you can't get rid of it out of your plant, then I think you know the answer. You're closing your plant.
Okay.
That's a tough thing to say, but that's the fact of life. And if you don't close it down, the regulators may close you down.
Okay. Let me see here. What would be the recommended frequency? Lots of questions around frequency, but here's one. What would be the recommended frequency to test for Listeria, LM, we'll say, in ready-to-eat fish plant?
Well, again, I understand that's covered under the seafood HACCP. I would do it as often as you need to do it initially to be able to establish that we don't have an issue. You can then back off the frequency, but you can't back it off to where you're not doing it at all. And then if you start to get positive hits, you would increase the frequency again. And it's the same with any other hazard in any other part of your process. You vary the frequency on things depending on how much of a problem are you having or how little of a problem are you having.
Yeah. So I think, Florence, you asked a question on how that you clean and sanitize on a Friday, come in on Monday, and swab before that you start up. Is that a good practice? So really, to your point, Dr. Bob, it really depends on if you're finding it. If you're finding it, then you've got to sort of adjust the cadence.
Well, yeah, because if you're going to swab after you've cleaned and sanitized, the chances are you're not going to find it, but it's there. And over the weekend, it's most certainly going to grow. So if you say, well, I'm going to come in on the morning and I'm then going to clean, and if I don't find it then you have to say, well, maybe it's not there because now the sanitizer's worn off and I've had a whole weekend of the environmental conditions starting to contaminate everywhere. So if your risk says that I'm not finding it on a Monday morning after I've left it sit all weekend, then I would say to you the chances are you don't have it, but be sure that you don't have it.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Bob, your status, oh, sorry, your presentation, I think that's meant to say, outlines to identify, eliminate, and then control. What's the best way to ensure my staff is trained and these steps are kept top of mind? Is it monthly, weekly? Should I conduct exams, in-person training?
Well, again, I would make sure that everybody understands what Listeria is. I'd make sure that everybody understands that we're making a Reg G product. I would make sure that everybody on sanitation understands that there are no cutting corners, particularly in this area, though you don't want them to cut corners anyway. And I would make sure that they're totally in. I would make sure that people who are swabbing have been incentivized to try to find it. And you're going to be happy if they find it. You're going to be unhappy if you then can't get rid of it, but you're going to be even unhappier if they don't find it and it shows up when you finish running.
Yeah, okay. If my product is known to stall the growth of Listeria, would my plant be exempt from swabbing, even though we're a non-climate controlled facility in a rural environment and we wet clean environment?
Yeah, the FDA says if you've got something in your product that's going to kill off bacteria after you packed it, then you are exempt. It's one of the exemptions to having to do environmental swabbing. But then you're going to have to prove that your product, if it had Listeria in it, before it gets to the consumer, whatever you say is in that product that's going to kill Listeria actually does it. So make sure you got all those validation studies.
Yeah. What about if production and packaging are in the same room?
Then you got a big challenge. That's why I said, I think you're going to finish up wanting to screen off that area. But again, if you can show there's no Listeria in that whole room, then I would say I wouldn't go to the point of trying to wall off that room. And if you say I can't wall off that room with solid walls, then at least go to the strip curtains to limit the amount of air movement in that room coming from outside, and then restrict the people who go into that curtained off area.
Okay, a couple questions on SOPs and validation of these. So I'll read you this one. How can a validation can be conducted to prove SOP are effective to eliminate Listeria in the plant? Does that make sense?
The fact that you're not finding it. Obviously, the validation of that is that you're not finding it, so therefore your sanitation program is effective in removing it if it's there, because you can never find it after you've done a cleanup. I'm going to tell you the chances are you may find it in areas of your plant before you clean, and that's why the FDA says you should try to find it under the worst conditions, not under the best conditions. But if you can't find it after you've cleaned up and you've done a really good job, and make sure, I'm saying, in all those little cracks and crevices and under the feet of all your equipment and anywhere it could be, then obviously you have validated your SOP or your SSOP.
Yes, I beg your pardon. She did say SOP. Can you comment, Dr. Bob, on how regulators outside of the U.S., how stringent they are in this area for LM?
Well, the trouble is, I don't think they're as strict as we are, because certain countries, including Canada, will allow a little bit of Listeria if the product doesn't support the growth of Listeria. Now, that doesn't mean I'm saying Canadian foods allow a whole lot of Listeria. They don't. But we are the strictest country on this. We certainly are. But we do recognize that other countries are basically trying to put out safe products as well. So therefore, we've recognized that 3 countries, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, basically have programs equal to or better than us. But after that, you have to go country by country. And I'm going to tell you that your chances are that you're going to get Listeria in something in some countries because they're really not aware of it or trying. And then right now, I'd be really careful about South Africa until they basically find the source of that Listeria, because they can't even find it in a year.
Yeah, okay. What's the industry standard to test for LM?
Well, obviously, the question is, they're going to swab for it, and you're going to swab for it, and then they're going to do tests. The lab will be the better equipped people to answer that question. But you can be doing Listeria species, which is a quicker test. It's less expensive. And if you want to buy one of these new instruments that are coming out now, you can actually swab and get your results, indicating results within a couple of seconds. And that's about all you need. So I don't know how expensive those pieces of equipment are. I'm not pushing those equipment as being the only way you can go. But if you want instant results, you may want to look into a couple of companies, one that's already got their machine out there and swabs, and the other one that's about to introduce it this next week in Tokyo.
Yep, okay. Is it acceptable on the eyes of a regulator to pass the responsibility to my customers and consumer and or supply chain customers? So I guess
Well,
a regulator.
If it's ready to eat, the answer is really no, and that's why I said you're not going to pass it to your customer if it's a ready to eat product. But if it's an ingredient that is then going to be further processed by your customer, yes, you can pass your hazards down to your customer. But usually your customers are further processors who's got a heat step.
Yeah, okay, very good. We are at the top of the hour, Dr. Bob, so I'll close it there. Folks, if you've entered a question, you didn't get a response, I will be communicating with Dr. Bob, so you'll get a response by email. A reminder, we've recorded today's webinar, and we'll share a link to the recording as well as the deck within a few business days. And thanks very much, Dr. Bob, for your presentation. Very, very insightful. Lots of compliments through the comments box. And thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you.